You see the calves out there hanging out by the pond. You know, I got that one animal that's all the animals, I was talking about, I got these 3 animals that are still just kind of they're kind of thin, and they're having a hard time packing on the pounds, and 2 of them are kind of sick, and one of them's a little bit more sick than the other one, and so I gave both of them a shot of antibiotics. The calves are responding well to the antibiotics, but they are still very thin. I have 2 animals over there that are very thin, and I actually went to the vet this morning, and I picked up a bottle of a different antibiotic. I picked up a bottle of a Macrocin, and so I'm gonna be I figured that by about tomorrow, if the calves have not shown signs of 98% improvement, then I will go ahead and give them another shot. And while I was at the vet, unfortunately, that paralyzed calf did die yesterday. He died sometime this morning, and so the paralyzed calf is dead. He died sometime today morning, something like that. And so, the 3 animals, they're doing well. They responded well to the antibiotics. But the thing is when the animals are that small, when you got a little 250-pound calf, when these calves are 200 pounds, just about 200 pounds. And I talk about this all the time. When you have a smaller animal, the smaller the animal is, the harder it is to raise that animal, right? Once you start going under about 350, you're entering the danger zone. All right. Because if anything goes wrong at all with the calf cannot recover unless you are very, very, very diligent about it. All right. If your calf starts having diarrhea, it's probably going to die. Well, I mean, but I'm talking about death diarrhea, like salmonella. I'm not talking about indigestion, right? If your calves are walking around out on a field, if you got a little 250-pound calf and that calf is walking around out on a field and finds a little puddle of water to drink out of, but that puddle of water has a little bit of poop in it, and they drink out of that pond, and they get E. coli poisoning, they get salmonella poisoning, congratulations, you now have a dead calf, all right? It can be something as small as that. And also, I got the calves put away in the preconditioning pen right now so that doesn't happen. All right, I talk about the whole death diarrhea situation, right? How do cattle end up with death diarrhea? And it's from I call it poo-poo water disease, right? Right, I call it poo-poo water disease. There's a reason I call it that. It's because if they drink water that has poop in it, they get sick. That's how they end up with death diarrhea. All right, I'm not talking about indigestion. I'm talking about legitimate death diarrhea. And, when it rains, you'll end up with these little puddles on the ground. And chances are those puddles will have either mud in it or they will have poop in it. And if the calves drink out of that water, they will legitimately die. All right, they will legitimately die. It can be something as small as that. It can be something like, it was 90 degrees, but with the heat index, it was 105. It was 90 degrees. The Weather Channel was saying it was going to be 90 degrees, but when you take a look at the heat index, it's 105. Your calves don't really know what's going on, and so they're sitting out in the sun. They get dehydrated. When they get dehydrated, they also develop BRD. Congratulations, now you have a dead calf. All right, it's very, very, very difficult to raise calves that are under 350 pounds. I cannot stress this, this point enough. All right, when you have calves that are under 350 pounds, especially if you start going under 200 pounds, you are entering the legitimate danger zone. All right, you are entering the danger zone, and if you do not know what you're doing, I would suggest that you do something else. All right, and I've always said that realistically, buying a 350-pound calf, they're not going to be easy, but they will be significantly easier. All right, when you start getting about that 350-pound range, you still have an opportunity to make some money, and your workload will be significantly less. All right. And, you pay about $1,400 for a 350-pound animal. Granted that you're buying steers and heifers, and you're buying them at about 1 to 1.5 type, medium, large frame. And so, the animals, they're responding well to the antibiotics. But they are still, I still got 1 or 2 animals over there that are just kind of, You know, they're still kind of just wonky. All right, they definitely need to pack on the pounds. And here's the thing, you know, when you start having an animal get sick, especially a small animal, the animal needs energy reserves. All right, you know, the immune system needs energy to, you know, to effectively you know, fight off the infection, right? And so the big problem with having a small calf that gets sick is that they start to lose weight. And if they start to lose weight, they run out of energy reserves very quickly. All right, they run out of energy reserves very quickly. And so, you know, effectively what's going to happen, the long story short, what's going to happen is when you have a small calf that gets sick, you're effectively just going to have a small calf that's dead. All right, you probably, you know, granted that you're not like very diligent about caring for that calf. Like me, you know, I've already given the calf a shot of fluorophenical. I've already given the calf 2 shots of Banamine, and I've already given the calf another shot of Zactran. All right, and I've given the calf a shot of Tenatril. All right, you know, and I started, you know, giving the medication to the animal the moment that I realized that the animal was even a little bit sick. Right, when I took a look at the animal, I was like, I think something is slightly wrong with the animal. That's when I started the medication. If you take a look at an animal and the animal already looks like, you know, like borderline, you know, pretty severely ill, it's too late. All right, this is also why I put such an emphasis on animal medication. If you don't know how to use medication for the animals, you're effectively you're not going to make it. I mean, you're just going to lose money. I mean, it is what it is. And, you know, I've talked about this all the time. In terms of a realistic perspective, you know, like even human beings, right? If effectively all human beings, 100% of human, you know, granted that you don't live in a third world country, all right, if you legitimately live in like a first world, somewhat developed country, effectively everybody that you know at some point in their life will have taken antibiotics. Like if you live in America, there is a very realistic possibility that at some point in your life you took antibiotics. And a lot of people don't know this, but if you did not take the antibiotics, you would have probably just flat out died. It doesn't matter what your infection was. Maybe you had a nasal infection. Maybe you had a whatever, you know, a lung infection. Maybe you had a cut that got infected. You know, it doesn't matter if the doctor gave you antibiotics. If you did not take those antibiotics, there is a very legitimate chance that you would have died. And it's the exact same way for cattle, okay? Cattle are, you know, they're mammals just like we are. All right, and effectively at some point in their life, all of these animals more or less will need a shot of antibiotics. Will need some kind of an antibiotic, you know, et cetera, all right? Granted, you know, that's, you know, vaccinations, et cetera, all right? They're going to need the medication. Or, it just is what it is. I mean, you know, you're just not going to make any money. I mean, you know, and the animal, you know, is just going to, you know, legitimately just die miserably, all right? You know, if my two, you know, I'm not going to say, you don't ever just have 2 choices. You can choose whatever you want. I mean, but very often, usually you know, especially if you're buying, like me, I buy my calves from a sale barn, right? Like you see all of these calves here. I went to a sale barn by myself and chose these animals out one at a time effectively. I legitimately went and bought these animals by myself, all right? I chose these animals by myself from a sale barn, okay? And when you go to a sale barn, you have to understand that, you know, the animals are very highly stressed. They are put in a very close quarters with other animals, and there is a you know, a type of pneumonia called sale barn pneumonia, and they call it sale barn pneumonia for a reason. When these animals go to a sale barn, there's a very realistic possibility that they start to, you know, that they catch the BRD. All right, they call it shipping fever. They call it shipping fever, BRDC, bovine respiratory disease complex, and they also call it sale barn pneumonia or sale barn sickness, and they call it that for a reason. All right, and you have to understand that, you know, there are legitimately times when people sell animals because they believe the animal is not doing well. It happens all the time, right? And if that illness begins to spread, it turns into a very severe problem. when you have BRD that spreads, you effectively cannot, when BRD starts to spread, it becomes very bad. Okay, as the illness spreads, it becomes very bad. All right, so it's a very, very, very realistic time to use antibiotics. All right, especially in a situation like mine, I go to the sale barn and I buy these animals effectively by myself, one at a time, two at a time, three at a time, something like that. All right, I buy these animals all by myself, and I buy them from the sale barn. When they go to the sale barn, they're effectively, when they come back from the sale barn, they will need a shot of antibiotics. And so when I take a look at everything, when I take a look at my balance sheet right now, I'm effectively leveraged about 75%. So I don't want to use any more leverage. All right, I would say that I'm leveraged about 75%. And so in my current situation, the only way that I would use more leverage, right, because, this is a very important concept to understand, right? The idea of a balance sheet, the appraisal value of an asset. When I take a look at my balance sheet, what is the appraisal value of my balance sheet? And then I leverage against that. Why do I do that? Because when I do that, I am leveraging against my own money, and I get a tax write-off, and I can appreciate the asset knowledgeably. Right? That's the big idea. All right, so as of right now, I am leveraged about 70% of my balance sheet. So in this situation, I would not use any more leverage. The only way that I would use more leverage is if I liquidated animals, expanded my balance. I took the money that I made from selling my animals and I bought more animals, and then I leveraged against the earnings. Right? The whole idea is, like, if I sell 5 animals, right? Let's say I sell 5 animals and I make enough money to buy 10. So I go to the sale barn and I buy 10. If I buy 10, then I am net positive 5 animals, right? If I'm net positive 5 animals, and let's say out of those 10 animals, let's say 1 or 2 die. So I have 8 animals, right? Let's just say I have 8 animals. So I sold 5, I bought 10, and I'm left with 8. I'm still net positive 3 animals, right? At that point, when I have stabilized the 8 animals, I would go to the bank and take a loan for 3 more animals. Makes a lot of sense, right? That's effectively how I run my balance sheet. All right, and when you go from 5 to 8, but just understand that I have about 50. So I wouldn't go from 5 to 8. I would go from 50 to 100, and then I'm not going to lose 20 out of 100 cattle. All right, maybe maybe I end up with whatever 90. All right, and if I go from 50 to 90, right, then my balance sheet, by the time I stabilize those 90 animals, my balance sheet will have appreciated, and I am appreciating more assets at the same time. So the leverage, the amount of debt that I have in ratio to my balance sheet, the leverage against the balance sheet has fallen, right? It might even be as low as 40%, right? And so it might be as, I had 70% leverage, but now my balance sheet is at 40% leverage. What does that look like in terms of cattle? I sold my 50 animals, I bought 100, and then I have 90 left, right? I had 10 die. So now I have 90 left. If I went from 50 to 90, then I am net positive 40 animals, right? So when I had 50 animals, my balance sheet was leveraged 70%. But now that I have 90 animals, and I have raised those 90 animals for about 2 months, and they have gone up in value, I have appraised my balance sheet, taken a look at how much debt I have, and now I have realized that my debt is at about 40%. I am leveraged about 40% of my balance sheet. So in this situation, what would I do? I would go and take a loan for 40 more animals. And if I take a loan for 40 more animals, that will put me at about 70% leverage of my balance sheet. Why would I do that? And am I encouraging that you go and you leverage yourself to the eyeballs? No, I'm not. Why would I do that? Because when I do that, I can take the debt and I can purchase an equitable asset that is tax deductible. All right, I get a tax benefit for doing this. I purchase the animal at its equitable evaluation, at its appraisal value, and then I appreciate the value of the asset, and then I can pay myself whatever I need whenever I need it. That's the big idea, right? And I talk about this in terms of a broader concept. Like me, the whole thing about this whole situation is that, and I talk about this all the time, you don't need $5 million to be rich. All right, realistically, and I talked about the whole idea of Mr. Earl, right? The man who makes $12 an hour, but has over $1 million in investments, right? And they produce him a return. He has stocks like Coca-Cola and et cetera, right? And effectively, if I, and I talked about this, if, and the reason, if I took all of, let's just say one day, let's just say, I said, whatever, I don't want to be in the cattle business anymore. I have decided that I don't want to be in the cattle business, right? If I took all of the money that I have made in the cattle business and I just bought the S&P 500 and then I went and fried chicken at Wingstop, I would still effectively have unlimited money, right? I would turn into a situation like Mr. Earl. All right, I talk about this all the time, in terms of a realistic perspective. There is no amount of money that will save you from being an idiot. But if you, in terms of a realistic sense, I'm not going to say, but I've always said it, there is no amount of money that will save you from being an idiot. If you're an idiot, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. You're just going to have to get it together, or you're just going to die poor. All right, and I've always said that, in terms of a realistic sense, if you're poor, you're even better off, monumentally better off being broke. You're monumentally better off being broke. You should not be choosing to be poor. Just go and be broke. Don't be poor, go and be broke. All right, and in terms of a realistic sense, I only know one person that's managed to do that, who has legitimately gone from being poor to being broke and then stay broke forever. I only know one person who managed to do that. All right, even that would be a miracle. Chances are you're not going to go from being poor to being extremely wealthy overnight, probably not even your entire life. Because something like this, and I put this in terms of a realistic perspective, like when you take a look at what I do, and you take a look at it from an objective lens, we're effectively talking about a 0.000000001%. And just to put things in perspective from what I have seen with my own life, I legitimately do not know anybody that even does 10%. I legitimately do not know anybody at all that does 10%. That's the situation that I'm in. Legitimately, I don't know anybody that's even doing 10%, not even getting close. And what does 10% look like? If you make $50,000 a year on a 10.5 acre field with a commercial cattle business, then you're at 10%. I make about $350,000 to about $500,000. This business makes about $350,000, $500,000 a year. If you can make $50,000 a year on a 10.5 acre field with commercial cattle, then congratulations, you are now at 10%. Now, with this information, go out and see if you can find anybody that does even 10%. All right, that's the situation that I'm in. I legitimately do not know anybody at all that does even 10%. Money talks. All right, money is not everything, but in terms of a realistic gauge for something like this, money is what it's a equivalent gauge for everybody. Because the dollar that I make is the same dollar as anybody else makes. If you want to know what it was like to legitimately go by yourself and start yourself a business that makes you $500,000 a year, if you want to know what that feels like, then go and do it. Chances are you're not even going to make it to the 10% mark if you live to be 5,000. It is legitimate. I mean, just go and see if you can even get to the 10% mark. All right, this is not a Disneyland journey. Nobody cares about an opinion. I actually did it. All right, and in terms of a realistic sense, I've talked about this in terms of the big idea of making money. Is that I legitimately do not worry about money at all. I don't have to worry about money at all. I'm more concerned about other things. I legitimately do not worry about money at all. If I legitimately decided that I did not want to be in the cattle business anymore, and I just liquidated all of my assets, and I just bought the S&P 500, and then I went and fried chicken at Wingstop because I got to do something, right? I got to do something, and so I figured I'm just gonna go and do whatever I want, and so I feel like frying chicken. So I went and I started frying chicken at Wingstop. I would still make over $10,000 a month. Granted that the S&P 500 produced an 8% return every year. And this is also what I mean by I'm not, and this is also, the whole thing, I am legitimately not concerned about money at all. That's the big benefit of making such a massive amount of money. The idea of the whole thing about making such a massive amount of money, the whole thing about it is that, the whole reason, it's not like, oh my God, now that I make this money, now I can go and be an idiot. That's not what it's about. The whole thing is that when you start to make a certain, I say it's about $15,000 a month. Once you start making over $15,000 a month, the money does not do anything effectively anymore. Anything that, effectively everything on the earth, you can buy it for $15,000 a month. Effectively everything. You want to buy yourself a nice house. You want to live in a nice house. You want to drive a decent car. You want to make sure all your bills are paid. And you want to be putting some money away for investments so that you can, not worry about money. $15,000 a month will legitimately do all of that. All of it. All right, effectively, once you hit about $15,000 a month, it is effectively unlimited money. And the whole situation that I'm in, right? When I talk about my situation, it's like, like me, I'm not looking to grow my business so that I can have more money. I'm not looking to grow my business so that I can have more money, okay? The money, it's already negligible to me. I borderline make about 10 times more money than I spend. In terms of my balance sheet, what does it look like? Effectively, every single month I sell about 10 cattle. And when I sell these 10 cattle, I realistically make enough money to buy 20. So I'll sell my 10 cattle, right? The whole thing, I put a lot of emphasis on this yesterday. The whole idea of the asset. When you have an asset, the big idea is to turn your asset into more assets by utilizing the asset. Right? So if I have 10 cattle and I sell my 10 cattle, I should be able to buy more than 10 cattle, right? In reality, I make enough money to buy 20. So I'll sell my 10 cattle and I'll make enough money to buy 20. But if I make enough money to buy 20 and I started off with 10, right? And let's say I buy 20 and let's say 17 of them survive. So let's say I sell 10, I buy 20, and I had 3 die. So that leaves me with 17. I would not buy 17, I would buy 24. All right, and if I go from 10 to 24, right, then my balance sheet has increased by 14 animals, right? But that's the whole idea, in terms of a realistic sense, it is what it is, all right? I'm the one, I actually made it. Nobody cares about an opinion, all right? If you want to be poor, then die poor by yourself, all right? Nobody cares. Don't pass the Kool-Aid. All right, don't give the punch to other people, all right? I actually made it. All right, I actually made it. And in terms of a realistic sense, you have to understand that I do not worry about money at all. Legitimately zero concerns about money. That is the benefit of making such a drastic amount of money. And I've talked about this, the whole thing. I think that this is it's not spoken of. A lot of people, it's whatever. You don't speak about this. It's, I don't know if it's like an idea that a lot of people don't consider. But the big idea of generating such a massive amount of money in perspective, in respective to how much I spend, I legitimately make about 10 times more money than I spend. The big benefit of that is that I am not concerned about money at all. That's the big benefit. The big benefit about making such a massive amount of money is not that I can go and buy myself 3 Lamborghinis. All right, that's not even capitalism, that's consumerism. The big benefit of me generating such a large amount of money is not that I can go and buy 3 Lamborghinis and whatever and a yacht. It's not that. The big benefit of generating such a large amount of money is that I do not have to be worried about money at all anymore. That's the big benefit. And if you don't know what that feels like, you should try it. You should legitimately try it. It feels incredibly good. All right, I'm not gonna, I don't know how else. I don't want to say it feels good, but it's incredibly like a very rewarding feeling. It's like, dang, I legitimately don't have to worry about money at all. Realistically, while I was asleep, I made myself about $350. If I legitimately just, it's a very good feeling. And if you haven't ever tried it, if you haven't ever thought about it, then maybe you should think about it and maybe you should try it. All right, just give it a shot. I'm not gonna, because then it makes me sound like a prick. But because there's something. Okay, when you take a look at something like this, and you take a look at what I'm doing, you have to understand that it's effectively, it doesn't matter. Your opinions don't matter. All right, money's not an opinion. All right, nobody cares. Die poor, have fun. Have fun in your moron Megazord. You put 50 bums in a room. What are you gonna have? You're gonna have 50 bums in a room. It's not like you're just gonna have some, Power Ranger Megazord. You just got 50 bums in a room. Congratulations. Nobody's going to get anywhere. Everybody's looking for validation. Nobody's looking to improve their life. Nothing. Right? And it turns into this death spiral. Wherever, you're effectively just a death by 1,000 cuts. Effectively you could end up in a situation where you're 75 with nothing. All right, you're 75 and you legitimately have nothing. All right, congratulations. All right, but I'm telling you, at the end of the day, from what I have seen, I generate more money by myself than effectively anybody on the entire planet, and it's by a massive margin. All right, I effectively generate more money by myself than anybody. Everybody, not everybody combined, but I effectively make more money by myself than the entire planet, just about, in terms of individual earnings. All right, when you take a look at what I did, we're effectively talking about a 0.0000001% success rate. I may legitimately be the only person on the planet that can do something like this. Not can, but actually does. Because if you're born average, you have the capacity to do 98% of this. You might even be able to do 110% of this. Right, because the whole thing about my situation was when I got started, I legitimately had to teach myself how to do all of this stuff. I didn't have this, right? I didn't have somebody that legitimately showed me how to do everything from the very beginning. Nobody showed me, nobody did that for me. And it took me a long time to make it. I legitimately didn't get paid until my 12th year. All right, but that's the situation that I'm in. I am legitimately not concerned about money at all. If I legitimately decided to exit the cattle business, if I said, you know what, I don't want to be in the cattle business anymore, and I just took all of the money that I made in the cattle business, all of my assets, and I just liquidated, and then I put the money in the S&P 500, and the S&P 500 made me an 8% return a year, and I went and fried chicken at Wingstop for $15 an hour, I would effectively turn into a Mr. Earl. Right here I am working my 40 hours a week at Wingstop, and I have over $1 million in the S&P 500. I have over $1 million. I'm making whatever. I make whatever. $12,000 a month, and I still would not worry about money at all. And in terms of a realistic sense, my bills are about $4,000 a month. All right, my house, my mortgage, my truck, my insurance, my bills, everything combined is about $4,000 a month. All right, why, and if I need $4,000 a month and my stock portfolio is going up by whatever, and I'm making, whatever, $15 an hour at Wingstop, why would I pay myself $7,000 if I only need four? I can pay myself whatever I need whenever I need it. Right? I can liquidate my assets when it's the same exact thing. It's not just cattle. It can be stocks. It can be whatever. I can pay myself whatever I need whenever I need it. That's the whole situation, right? That's effectively, my whole thing about money, and when it comes down to it, I legitimately I'm not concerned about money at all. If I legitimately just took the money that I made in my cattle business and I said, you know what, I don't want to be in the cattle business anymore. I don't want to be in the cattle business. I want to exit the cattle business. I could just take all of my money, put it in the S&P 500, fried chicken at Wingstop, and I would still have more money than I could ever use. Granted that the S&P 500 went up by about 8% a year, which it does on the long-term average, right? And there's a lot of reasons for that. The whole broader economy, the U.S. economy is the best in the world. There was a lot of deficit spending, and when you have deficit spending, you are effectively, disproportionately increasing the money supply in relation to the asset supply. And when you do that, the assets that already exist go up in dollar amounts. The S&P 500 is effectively a small piece of the 500 biggest companies in America. All right, so, long story short, if there is inflation, the price of the S&P 500 will go up. All right, and so, it just is what it is. I mean, I legitimately do not have to be concerned about, I am not concerned about money at all. Legitimately 0%. That's the benefit of making such a drastic amount of money. And I have taken a look at my situation. I understand what is happening. My business, if I just take the money that I make in my business and I reinvest it into my business grows by about 20 to 25% a month. Realistically, it's about 25 to 30% because I also use leverage, but I am not using leverage right now. All right, what does this look like in terms of something other than the money? In terms of numbers, what does this look like? When I sell about 10 cattle a month, and when I sell my 10 cattle, I make enough money to buy about 20. That's what it looks like. I have 50 animals total. I have 45 animals total. All right, and if I go to the sale barn and I sell 10 and I buy 20, and let's say I have 17 survive, I'm still net positive 7 animals. I would go to the bank and take a loan for another 7 animals. Right now, my balance sheet is about 70% leveraged, right? My balance sheet is about 70% leveraged. And I would anticipate that in the next 2 to 3 months, I end up selling about 30 cattle. And if I sell 30 cattle, and let's say I make enough money to buy 60, which would be a very reasonable estimate, if I lowball it, let's say 55. So I sold 30 and I made enough money to buy 55. I still have 15 animals at home, so that leaves me with 70 cattle. So I went from 50 to 70. And and when we consider death loss, it's better to lowball it. So let's just say I end up with 70 cattle. So if I went from 50 cattle to 70 cattle in the next 2.5 to 2 to 3 months, then my business has grown by about 40% in the next 2 months. Right, my business has grown by about 40% by just taking the money that I make in the business and putting it back into the business. And if my business grew by 20 animals, I would then, once I have taken a look at my assets and I have determined that they are stable, I would leverage against them. So I wouldn't buy 70, I would have 90. And at that point, I would still maintain that 70% debt ratio. That's the whole idea, okay? The whole idea of utilizing debt. Why do I utilize debt? I utilize debt so I can purchase more assets. When I purchase these assets, I purchase them at an equitable evaluation, the appraisal value. This asset is worth money to everybody, not just me, not just Billy Joe Bob. It is worth money to everybody. What is that dollar amount? That is the appraisal value. If you want to figure out the price of a commodity, how do you do that? You go on the stock market and you look it up. A commodity is a commodity for a reason. The value, the commodity, there are a lot of commodities: fertilizer, cattle, gold, wheat. There are commodities, all, silver, all sorts of commodities. The reason that a commodity is a commodity is because they are valuable to everybody. If I took one of these cows and took them to a different part of the world, the chances are the cow will still be valuable. What is that evaluation? What is that value, right? That, how do you find that the value of an animal? Right? You go on the stock market and you look up feeder cattle price. And when you look up feeder cattle price, you are looking at an 800-pound animal. Number one type commodity animal. When you go to the sale barn, chances are you're, like me, I don't buy straight number one type animals. I buy 1.5. Sometimes I'll even buy plainer animals. I haven't really bought a plainer animal in a long time. But I buy 1 to 1.5 type medium large frame animals. I don't buy straight number one. I buy number 1.5. And I buy a mix of bulls, steers, and heifers. So how do I account for that? I take a 10% deduction off of the feeder cattle price. And then, and in terms of how much margin do I want to make, I cut that number in half. And when I cut that number in half, right, what kind of animal, what weight of an animal am I buying? About 250 pounds, all right? I buy them at about 250 pounds for that price. All right, it's a very systematic way of making money. That's the whole thing about how I make money, is I call it printing my own money, because at the end of the day, I can systematically make, money. All right, that's one of the big things, is that I can intentionally make money. All right, like if I had $5,000, I could turn that $5,000 into $100,000 in 2 years, no problem. All right, and when it comes to money, when it comes to personal finances, when it's legitimately we're just going to talk about money and personal finances, I am effectively one of the best in the world at it, all right? I am one of the best in the world at it, borderline one of the best in the world at it. Am I like like the greatest in the world at it? No, but I am extremely good at it. I am extremely good at it. I've effectively put myself in a situation where I legitimately don't even worry about money at all anymore. I don't worry about money. I don't have to, because even if I felt like leaving the cattle business, I could just take all of the money that I made in the cattle business and put it in the S&P 500. And granted that the S&P 500 made me an 8% return a year, and I fried chicken at Wingstop, I went and did something, I would still effectively make enough money to buy anything on the entire planet. Just about. Short of like drugs, alcohol, a yacht, jet, gambling, short of anything like that, I could buy anything on the planet. I could buy myself a house, I could buy myself a car, I could pay for all of my bills, and I'd still probably have a few thousand, I probably still have $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a month left over. All right, it doesn't matter. All right, it doesn't matter. I legitimately do not worry about money at all. 0%. If I want to buy something, I just buy it. I don't even spend time thinking about, should I buy this or should I not buy this? I just buy whatever. Granted that it's not something idiotic, like 3 Lamborghinis. If I want to buy whatever, then I just buy it. Within a reasonable margin, I just buy it. If I want to buy myself a couple new t-shirts, I just buy it. I don't have to think about it. Oh my God, what's the price of this t-shirt and what's the price of that t-shirt? Granted that I don't like go to the Gucci store. If I'm like at Bass Pro Shop, or if I'm at Costco shopping and I buy whatever I want, whatever I need, I buy it. And then I'm walking to the front and I see a couple of t-shirts. Then I just buy, and I feel like buying a t-shirt, I just buy it. I don't have to think about it. I don't even waste my time thinking about it. All right, it's whatever. If I go to the grocery store and I want to buy steak and shrimp, then I buy steak and shrimp. All right, oh my God, should I buy ground beef instead of steak? I don't do none of that. I mean, oh my God, while I'm at the grocery store and I'm looking for steak and shrimp and I see a bottle of kombucha and I'm like, you know what? I just want to drink this kombucha. I just buy it. Oh my gosh, should I not buy the kombucha because it's $3.50? Oh my, I don't think about stuff. It's water. I just buy it. All right, that's the big benefit of generating such a large amount of money. The big benefit of generating such a large amount of money is not that you can be an idiot. There is no amount of money that will save you from being an idiot. And I think that this is, the big disconnect between the average American, because the average American sees the world as a consumer and not as a capitalist. All right, capitalism is good. Consumerism is not exactly a fantastic, economic model. Okay, a lot of Americans in particular see the world through the lens of a consumer, but I see the world through the lens of a capitalist. I have chosen to become successful. I will work to become successful because I want to have a better life for myself. I don't want to be in a situation where I'm struggling for things all the time. So I have decided that I'm going to go and do what it takes to do better for myself. It doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. So I go and I do it. And now now as of today, I am effectively now in a situation that I don't worry about money at all. I don't worry about money at all, legitimately 0%. All right, even if I felt like exiting the cattle business, if I exited the cattle business, liquidated my assets, put the money in the S&P 500, and then went and fried chicken at Wingstop, I would still legitimately never run out of money. Granted that I didn't become an idiot. It doesn't matter. All right, I don't know how else to put it. It just is what it is. And that is also, and in terms of just, what if I can introduce an idea, just, open your perspective. Not, having to, not worrying about money is an incredibly good feeling. All right, it is an incredibly, I wouldn't say it's a good feeling. I don't know how else to put it, but it's just, I legitimately, nobody can offer me money to do anything. Legitimately, not having to worry about money, it is what I legitimately do not have to worry about money at all. All right, and that's in terms of my perspective. If I could introduce that idea and have it, grow in the world, it is just what it is. All right, I legitimately do not worry about money at all. All right, nobody can pay me to do anything. Nobody's offering me anything. All right, in terms of money, nobody's offering me anything. And in terms of a realistic perspective, I can already buy anything on the entire planet. Just about anything. All right, it doesn't matter. Even if I felt like leaving the cattle business, if I felt like exiting the cattle business, if I just liquidated all of my assets, took that money and bought the S&P 500 and then went and fried chicken at Wingstop, I would still never run out of money. Granted that I didn't become an idiot. That's what it feels like. All right, I legitimately do not have to worry about money at all. 0%. If I want to buy it, I just buy it. Granted that it's not like drugs, alcohol, gambling. Granted, a yacht, private jet, 3 Lamborghinis. Granted that it's not something like that. And and I'm not bashing anybody. Like, if you got 3 Lamborghinis and you got $400 million, then it doesn't matter, right? And in terms of a realistic perspective, I mean, it is what it is. All right, my net worth will probably grow drastically in the future. All right, even as of today, I mean, my business is growing by about 30% a month. All right, I've effectively hit a point in the monetary system where the amount of money that I'm making is effectively just becoming so drastic that it's whatever. Over the next 3 months, I'll probably end up selling about 30 out of my 50 cattle, out of my 45 cattle, and I'll probably make enough money to grow my herd to about 70 animals, 80 animals, something like that. All right, and and it's just, by the end of the year, I'll probably be running, close to 200. I'll probably end up running, 200 cattle at a time by the end of the year. I'm running about 45 cattle right now. I started off with 50 and I got 45. And, by the end of the year, I'll probably be running about 200 by myself. All right, I may legitimately end up running about 350, 400 cattle for the year. Maybe even 500. All right, and, it just is what it is. But, I mean, it is what it is. And I'm not a malicious person about it. I understand it is what it is. You know, I make a drastic amount of money. I legitimately make enough money to where I don't have to worry about money at all. And, you know, and that's the thing that maybe I can share in terms of the perspective. And when you take a look at what I do, we're talking about a 0.000000001% success rate. Most people cannot even do 10%. I have not seen anybody do 10% to this day. And if you want to talk whatever, right, then go out and make sure that you can at least do 10%. You know, because I talk about this, I say money talks, right? At the end of the day, I actually do it. Right, I actually do it. I actually started this business, grew the business by over 1,000%. First generation farmer, make about $350,000 to $500,000 a year, and realistically, by the end of the year, I will have about doubled that, maybe even a little bit more. I actually did it. All right, so you know you should consider that as well. I actually did it. All right, you know, if you're going to talk trash or whatever, then, you know, make sure that you can at least do 10%, or you're just a bum with an opinion. And nobody cares about your opinion, you know, and especially if you go around and finding other people that agree with your worthless opinion. Now you're just sharing the Kool-Aid. You're just giving the punch out to other people. You know, die poor by yourself. All right, I actually made it. I actually managed to do it. And that's it for me today, YouTube. Y'all have a good one.